All right, let's go ahead and begin so we can be right on time. You win the prize for choosing the most unhappy session at the end of the day. Hope you're doing something interesting afterwards. My name is Jeanne Allert. I'm going to give you just a very brief introduction to me. But I want to make a little preamble about this session. If you came to this session last year, go find something else to do. Oh, I know it was, you just have to do it twice. Oh, it's so good. No pressure. No pressure. Well, we ran this session twice last year, and it was standing room only, and it was just kind of insane that Steve said we have to come back and get this information out. So it is my honor, because this is a big passion of mine, to get the information out about this unique subtype of domestic sex trafficking. But to set my remarks, let me tell you just a little bit about me. In 2007, the Lord decided that he was going to rescue me from affluence and comfort, and he threw me from consulting life in Washington, D.C., where everything was, posh back then, and said, sell all you have and give it to the poor, which basically meant that he was going to set me up for an encounter with a woman named Heather, who was a prostituted woman on the streets of Baltimore. And meeting this woman and having her be really the incarnate version of a problem that I didn't know existed, that I hadn't paid any attention to, and people that I had frankly walked past in my life, he put that right front and center in the embodiment of this gal, Heather. And when I met her and I heard a little bit about her story, it became that one of those holy rage moments where you shake your fist and you're like, God, you should do something. Be careful when you say that, because what he was basically doing was calling me into the world of domestic sex trafficking. The interesting irony was I was actually raised in Bangkok, so you would think if God was going to send me into trafficking, I'd be in Bangkok, not Baltimore, but whatever. And so this is where I ended up. And so in 2007, I established the first residential program in the Mid-Atlantic for adult and minor female victims of domestic sex trafficking. Now that sounds lofty and intentional. Had no idea what I was doing. Not a clue. I just knew that Heather broke my heart. I knew I had this big property, open the door, see what happens. And that's so important for you to understand, because everything that I know about this field over the last almost 20 years has been learned largely from the survivors themselves and some of the people who've been the most kind and patient teachers for me. In 2018, though, we suspended direct care and we became the Institute for Shelter Care, because after looking at the landscape of care across the United States for this particular problem, we saw such a deficit of care. And by then, we had attracted people, had wanted to learn our model and wanted to learn from our successes, that became a pivot to say, the field is ripe for harvest, but the workers were far too few. And what we needed to do was shift into raising up the next generation of care providers. So what we do at the Institute is we work with the 211 shelters across the United States, of which 155 of them are Christian shelters, and they are serving adults and minors and labor trafficking and sex trafficking and all kinds of different variations in between. A little bit about my education, just so that you understand that when I was in second grade and they said, or no, it was actually fifth grade, and they have you take those little things and they say, you should either be a teacher, a minister, or a counselor. I missed the or part. Just letting you know. So a lot of my approach, what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you about this study that I did, first iteration of the study in 2020, second iteration of the study in 2021. But to back up, the impetus for even getting into this study was in doing that direct care with survivors. I was encountering, and learning every day, but I was encountering some things that just started to put data points on the table. And one of them was that we were seeing a statistic that is still hardy today, that's about 97% of sex trafficking survivors were also victims of childhood sexual abuse. It's an extraordinarily high correlation. But we were collecting a lot of other data points as well, like 11% of our survivors had grown up in households where somebody else, oftentimes their mother, was also a prostituted person. I came across this study in 2019 that was out of Kentucky by Middleton et al., and they had examined 696 cases of child sex trafficking in that state, and they did a deep dive analysis on those cases. That was over a 5-year period of time, and they found that 47% of those cases, the children were being exploited by a caretaker. And I thought, well, that was very interesting. But what really provoked me was I spent a lot of time with our survivors. I was all in. And when you're sitting there and you're doing the family phone call and she's calling home to mom and it's a once-a-week phone call and she only gets 20 minutes. And so you think that's really precious time. And as a mother, I, of course, was thinking through the lens of somebody who would be so invested in my daughter's been rescued and now she's going to get on this healing journey and she's going to be well. And I would hear these really bizarre conversations coming from the families. And such that, and I'll just be straight up with you, it's like, yo, B, get your ass back home and make some money. And you're like, it's a very strange thing for a mother to say. And I'm just lodging these things in my mind going, I don't understand what's happening here. And what really then pushed me further was I just started contacting some of my law enforcement friends who were making these referrals. I'm like, how often do you see that there's something going on with the family? And just anecdotally, they were saying, oh, 30% of the time, 50% of the time, 80% of the time, oh, you've always got to look at the family. I'm like, all right, maybe we're on to something. So that sent me down this rabbit hole of let me try to see what the literature has to say about the phenomenon of a family member being involved somehow in the exploitation of this child. Well, as you begin this study, if you do, you will find that it is very, very difficult because it's not a linear path, mostly with the language. The language doesn't afford us to do a thoughtful study on this because the language for this particular phenomenon hasn't landed yet. And so you'll see all of this different kind of terminology out there. I was intentional to in parallel study abuse because I thought, well, we've got to at least look at the unique dynamic of that relationship and that context of family. And so we have, of course, incestuous abuse or incest, intrafamilial sexual abuse. I only see that terminology internationally and one state we'll mention. But then there's this one, conventional child sex abuse, gross. What's conventional? Anyway, I digress. Go with me. Sarcasm is a coping skill. Conventional child sexual abuse, but with payment. So obviously they're adding on this element to child abuse. They're going, something different about this child abuse because it's with payment. But I haven't seen that many other places than that 04 study. Then a good academician always comes up with their own acronym, Family Facilitated Juvenile Sex Trafficking, or FFJST. You don't have to remember that one. I haven't seen it anywhere else. But then we saw some interesting literature coming out of Australia, particularly Michael Salter's work, which I think is utterly fascinating. He has a text called Organized Sexual Abuse, and essentially he does 4 different chapters in this book out of Routledge Press, and he talks about different organized forms of abuse, and organized meaning multiple perpetrators, often multiple victims. And what we see in trafficking, it might be single victim, multiple perpetrators. But he's looking at the multiple dynamic. And so think of things like Jeffrey Epstein, okay, and the island, multiple victims, multiple perpetrators in an organized construct. So he looks at institutional abuse, he looked at organized, he looked at ritual, and then his other chapter was on family. And the reason I think this is pivotal is because for us to understand this phenomenon, we have to think of family outside of our own perhaps nostalgic or romantic views of family, and we have to think of family as a system. And we have to think of the way systems operate in order for us, one, to be a bit more objective, because bias always comes in when we talk about family, but 2, not only to be more objective, but also to look at the dynamics of a system for us to better understand this phenomenon. So I think Michael's got a lot to offer us, but we're going to land on the term familial sex trafficking, because that seems to be the one that is getting adopted domestically. So let's go ahead and define that, familial sex trafficking. It is a subtype of trafficking. Now there are some 36 different types of trafficking. And let me just say, for those of you with cameras, I know I'm cute, but you don't have to take my picture. I will give you all these slides. I will give these to you. You ask me, everything I have is yours, no problem. We want to go through this definition, and we want to understand that familial sex trafficking, so it's a subtype of trafficking where we're specifically looking at the family member facilitating sexual access to the child. Now that's key because sometimes our mindset when we think of sex trafficking is we think of the offender and the victim, right, who is inflicting the abuse, but in familial, we'll have to hold the definition of the person who's granting access to the child, the gatekeeper, as the perpetrator. Well, we immediately have to stop on family member and say, what do we mean when we say family member? Because there's so many different constructs of family. And so we have to look at the legal definition. And in most legal statutes, you see that it's one of two definitions, either a consanguine relationship, so you think blood relative, and that's often defined by the immediacy of mother, father, siblings, grandparents. So it doesn't go into cousins and whatnot. So a consanguine relationship, or a custodial, think legal relationship. So that might be somebody who's married in, a spouse, stepfather, mother, adopted, or in-laws. So that's the definition from a legal perspective, and that at least helps us sort of confine the universe of who are we talking about when we're talking about familial, except, much like in other areas of law, Cornell has a different definition. Their definition of immediate family member also is inclusive of foster children and foster parents living in the same household. Fascinating, right? It's because when I hold that up against the fact that we now know in the United States, a statistic that is regularly quoted and has validity, is that among children who are trafficked in the United States, 60% of them have had some intersection with the foster care system. Now, what's also important for us to understand is when we think about family, we make certain assumptions, right? You think about, remember, about a system, we make assumptions about everybody in my family system uses the same language. Do you say dinner or do you say supper? Do you know you're supposed to come home when it's dark outside? Do you know what mama means when she says, right? Like you know those things because you know the language, you know the rules, you know who's in the system, who's outside of the system, right? You get that about family. But if we look at the foster care system within the United States, we have on average a child in foster care will have 11 placements before their 18th birthday. So that's a child who has learned 11 different systems. In Maryland, it was 13. I met a group in Mississippi at the children's home, and they said they had a kid who had had 53 placements. So but here's what we have to get in about that is, so you've got a kid that's had, let's say on the lower end of the scale, 11 placements. That child has relearned who are the members, what are the rules, what's the system, right? It is not as anchored, and we can't make as many assumptions about that system as we can when we are talking about the family in which you were reared. So I think this adds another layer of complexity depending upon how we define that universe of actors. Now, I told you I was taking a look specifically at incest because it is a separate legal statute, and we have to understand what might be the differences between calling this an incestuous act versus a familial trafficking act. And these are some of the contrasts between the two. I'll unpack some of these as we go, but in broad strokes, in incest, the perpetrator is the offender. Right? The one who has access to the child is also the one who's inflicting the abuse, if that's the father or the mother, right? In familial trafficking, the perpetrator is the one who grants access, but the offender is the one who is committing those acts of violence against the child. What we see in early literature is that the onset of abuse for incest is often very young. It can be toddler age. It can be infant age. We do not yet have sufficient data on familial trafficking to know when typically the onset of abuse is within the home. But there is some early suggestion that some of these relationships start out as incestuous relationships and then become commercialized. So they move from within the family members being the perpetrators to outside of the family. So that's where we see in incest, oftentimes the abuse is confined within that system, but in trafficking, we go outside of that system. And here's some of Salter's work. When we look at incest, this can be any combination of one offender, one victim, victim, multiple offenders, etc. But when we look at familial trafficking, oftentimes what we are seeing is multiple offenders and multiple victims. But it certainly can be one child. Here's also the big key difference that we have to pay attention to is in the incest dynamic, the motivation, the why behind the act is personal gratification. And I would say personal gratification / power, because we see a lot of abuse and sadistic abuse that can occur in that phenomenon. But the motivation in the familial context is almost always economic. There is some gain, there is some commercial gain, not personal gratification. So these are just at a high level a contrast between these two different phenomenon. So just for those of you who are the nerds in the room, I want you to understand that this was a mixed method descriptive study. And the reason that's important is because we weren't looking to prove or disprove any theory. This is a phenomenon that generally we don't know much about at all. And so it's really just sort of putting it in the middle of the room and go, I don't know, does it walk, does it talk, what does it do? We don't know anything about it. And so this study does not lead us to any conclusions. It's just beginning to take us to a place where we can kind of hone it in and study it more thoughtfully. So that's my encouragement to any of you who are more academically inclined, that there is a wide open berth of opportunity for more study on this particular issue and a real dearth of existing literature. But what I wanted to set out to do was to look at 3 key areas in defining this. One, the prevalence, because people are always asking you, how big is the problem, right? Anybody in the anti-trafficking field, you're always saying, well, is it big in Covington, Kentucky? How big is it? Are we the worst in the country? As if being the worst is the best. I don't get it. But we wanted to look at prevalence so that we could see, are there numbers that we could reliably quote so that we could mobilize? What are the characteristics that make this phenomenon unique from other aspects of domestic sex trafficking? And are there key challenges that as we look at familial trafficking within larger systems like identification, investigation, prosecution, and victim services, what unique challenges are presented in any of those? Now, as I mentioned, there hasn't been a lot of study on this issue domestically. There's been more study about this particular phenomenon internationally. And of the 5 studies that I was able to find about this domestically, one of the key criticisms about those studies was they had such small sample sizes. One had 19 cases, one had 31 cases. The largest one to date was 157. That was the one I did in 2020. So when you have an N of only 30, it's really hard to say that that's generalizable. And so that was a key criticism, and why I'm very confident in telling you that you can walk away with some good reliability for this information, because our basis of cases that were examined was 3,500 child sex trafficking cases, of which 917 were confirmed to have been familial cases. So our ultimate N, as we go through here, is 917, a much larger sample upon which to draw some of these early conclusions. So the first question is literature, is prevalence. And what we were looking at in examining the literature was we found numbers all over the place. Of those 5 different studies that I mentioned, we saw anything from 40% to 12% to 16% to 62%. And if you have a 50-point spread, I don't play sports, but for those of you who do, a 50-point spread would be bad, right? If you have a 50-point spread in statistics, you cannot say that you actually can define something. And so we were not seeing anything conclusive across the extant studies that were done. And so what we had to do is do a deeper dive, what we did at our shop was we contacted all of the offices of attorney generals across the United States and asked them for their most recent human trafficking report for their state. Because there is no central warehouse of data where all human trafficking data resides. It does not exist, no matter what anybody will tell you. And there's data that's kept at a county level, at a state level. They're not always shared, federal cases, all of that. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to say, well, at least at the state level, can we see whether or not they're seeing this same phenomenon? Now, just so you know, all of the OAGs do not even produce human trafficking reports. But of the ones that we did, because that language that I mentioned up front is inconsistent, we had to just basically read every line to see, what do you call it, right? What do you think? We couldn't go to the index and just go to familial. Here's what we learned just in this quick review of the, well, it wasn't quick. It wasn't quick at all. In this lengthy review, but one slide for your purposes. South Carolina, 19%. Hawaii says 25%. First trafficker was a family member. Colorado is the only state that uses intrafamilial because they're so European. Minnesota said, whatever. Minnesota says 45% were recruited by a family member, but 24% trafficked by a family member. Now, Kentucky's an interesting one because they have a 2019 study, so there's much earlier, but they have done a study subsequent to that, actually twice. In 2019, they were looking at around 47%. Then in the 2023 data that just went to the Attorney General says that they now are seeing it at 60%. Of their cases, of their child trafficking cases, are familial. But what's interesting is they don't call it familial at all. They call it caretaker perpetrator. So now we have yet again another term, right? But this is important for you because as you want to study this, you can't just rely on the language, as I established. And then Mississippi just did a study in 4 counties, and they found it to be the #1 most common form of exploitation in those 4 counties. So if you take all of this and you kind of throw it into a blender, where does that lead us? And where that leads us is across this particular study that I'm sharing with you today. We saw that of the 917 out of the 3505, it's 26% of those cases were confirmed as familial. But if you add that up against not only the prior studies, but the reports that are coming out of the offices of Attorney General, what we're seeing is anywhere from 26 to 47, or a quarter to a half of child trafficking cases may be familial. And I say that because we don't know conclusively, but that should attune us, because if you are encountering any child trafficking cases at all, you should at least have in your imagination a quarter to a half of these could be familial based on where we are in understanding the data. Now, as I mentioned, there's no single database that we can go to get this information, and we are keenly challenged in victim identification across sex trafficking in general, because it's one of those, as I established with Heather, is sort of hidden in plain sight, right? You just sort of walk past it and don't notice, or you just don't see what's happening in the community. We're making some strides in that area, but an overall lack of awareness in society is going to beget less data. The old adage being true, if you're not looking for it, you're not going to count it, right? We also know that victims are reluctant to report, and so this isn't something where they are just coming forward because we've established a hotline number. And we also know that familial victims are, because of what we know about incest and what you know about that relationship, they are even then more disinclined to come forward as a victim and may not see themselves as a victim at all. One officer who responded to this study said, well, we have to assume that trafficking, specifically familial trafficking, is probably not advertised in the same way. I mean, in paraphrase, what he's saying is, who would be so stupid as to put their kid on the internet? Like, you got to be kidding me. So we have to imagine that in the familial context, this is probably transactions that are happening more word of mouth. So he put that forward, and we're like, yeah, that seems pretty plausible. Now, one of the other things that we learned later was that individuals who had been trafficked said that the trafficking advertisements, if you think the PSAs, the posters that are in your airport or behind your bathroom door or whatever, wherever you're seeing them, the early ones coming out of the Blue campaign at the federal government had images of individuals that survivors couldn't relate to. So if you think, let's say one of them was specifically a Hispanic woman who was clearly a domestic who was cleaning a house, right? Well, if you're a 13-year-old girl and your mom's selling you for drugs, you don't relate to that. That's not something you connect with. So the images have changed over time, so I put these out there because we have evolved in terms of trying to create a broader diversity of renderings so that we might have somebody who says, you know, I can more relate to that, that more looks like me. But we're also challenged because we're not well trained to look for this type of crime or look for this type of abuse. There was an interesting study that was done by Reed et al., and they specifically studied juveniles who were being trafficked and their experience within the juvenile justice system. And what he found was that it was frequent that juveniles who were picked up for engaging in prostitution, which even by definition is incorrect, they were either wrongly identified as offenders. So you think of it this way, she's 17 years old, she's a prostitute. Okay, that would be legally incorrect, but if that's the way you're perceiving what you're encountering, or maybe they were manipulated by the exploiter to engage in other criminal offenses, so she might be identified for theft, for trespassing, for assault, other types of crimes, or the victimization may have coincided with alcohol or drug abuse that increased the likelihood of them being identified by law enforcement. What was so interesting about this particular study was we looked specifically through the lens of justice professionals who had encountered these cases, and 80% of them said that they had cases in their caseload out of that 917 where they had initially encountered a juvenile and thought that juvenile to be willfully engaging in prostitution, only to find out later that there was a familial actor behind the scene. But it required them, as I will repeat, to ask the next best question. You've got a 15-year-old at a motel. The next best question should be, how'd she get there? She didn't drive, right? What's the next best question? And we have to get better at that. 80% of the time they said they had encountered that particular situation. We're certainly challenged in identifying victims because they may be manipulated by their parents. Obviously they are, but also by culture. And I think that that's something we have yet to really tap into, is how much culture is impacting the way children are seeing their abuse and interpreting abuse. Much more to be said about that. I can't wait to come back next year and talk about my next study. But what we have seen in the little bit of data that we have is that familial trafficked children tend to have higher incidences of truancy. About 84% of the time, we will see that these children are not showing up to school on a regular basis, and a pretty high incident of some other intersection with the child welfare system. Well, certainly if we're talking about foster care, but it could be other areas of child welfare. Here's what I thought was interesting. This particular study said that almost 52% of cases that were identified in a hospital emergency room, they did report to Child Protective Services. 45% were uncovered by a police investigation. But in 6 of those cases, even if the child had come to the ER multiple times, it did not provoke suspicion. And so that's something that when we were talking earlier, Steve and I, about what can medical professionals do, and I would say particularly because you're community-based, if you have the ability to track the repetition of a visit, just like we would in child abuse cases, seeing, oh gosh, that kid has presented for bruising repeatedly, this should be provoking alarm for us. Now, there's only been one study that has said that they concluded that familial perpetrators are less likely to present their child to a medical professional if that child is injured. And we can imagine why that would make sense. So if that child, let's say, has all kinds of pelvic bruising, I'm not going to take that child to the ER because that would perhaps provoke suspicion. And so what the parent can do that maybe the third-party exploiter can't do is the parent can just say, I'm keeping Susie home from school today, right? And the school's going to be like, okay, mom, right? And that doesn't raise any suspicion whatsoever. I think when you add on top of that some of the other things that we have going on, like all of the kids locked in at home, you know, from the pandemic, right, and other areas where that environment of the home can become more and more insular, then it's just fewer adults that might intersect with that child, which means that we are less inclined to identify these kids. Another area that came up interesting out of the study when we were talking with the justice professionals was we asked them whether or not they had used any kind of screening tool to identify these kids as being exploited, and they said that only 22% of the respondents said that their jurisdiction uses any kind of screening tool whatsoever. I am not suggesting that a screening tool is 100%. Right? But the fact that there wasn't let's say, even an organized protocol for determining whether or not we should ask questions about potential exploitation. The most common tool out of the few that were being used was the CCHF tool, Commercial Sexual Exploitation. It's out of the West Coast Children's Center. If it's something you're interested in, it's probably the most ubiquitous tool. But what is interesting about it is of the agencies using the CCHF tool, almost all of them said that they modify it. And that stands to reason because I've done this familial trafficking presentation across the country. And in particular, when I am in unique areas of our nation, let's say, for example, on a Native American reservation, they have different language, they have a different jurisdiction, they have a different culture. And so they may add different questions or modify the questions. You know, I'm Baltimore, so if you want to talk about your mother figure, you better be talking about grandma and auntie, because it's just culturally more patterned in that area that there's grandma or auntie in their immediate sphere. And so it's just important to know that. You may want to modify the tool based on either your cultural context, significantly. Now there's another study, and this one just makes me so angry, but I share it with you. And we have individuals like yourselves who are mandated reporters, right? And we looked at this particular study by Hardinger and this one other by Mitchell and Finkelhor, and they took an examination of the 14 states that changed their mandated reporting rules to include sex trafficking as a form of child abuse. So as many of you may know, right, you have your child abuse statute, and then you have to describe what child abuse means, right? How it could manifest. Sex trafficking wasn't in the list. And so for many states, like mine in Maryland, we had to go through and amend that statute to put sex trafficking on the list to say if you're doing that, that is a form of child abuse. And that's really important because maybe the child abuse statute carries higher penalties than some other forms of crime. So it just gives the legal field more to work with. But of the 14 states like Maryland that did that, what was interesting according to this study is that almost none of them mandated that you be trained. So here you are, mandated reporter, you now have to look for incidences of trafficking, but we're not going to tell you how. There was no appropriation, there was no plan for training. So what do we think is going to be the incident increase in that identification? Very, very little, because you don't know what you're looking for. In fact, out of almost 600 mandated reporters in their study, over half of them said that they'd received no training of any kind. So it might as well be moot. But this is the other piece of the study that I thought was fascinating on mandated reporters. And this one is specifically the Hardinger study. And in this Hardinger-Saunders study, what they did was they looked at mandated reporters in two industry areas, academics and healthcare, right? So not all mandated, just those two fields, academics and healthcare. And what they wanted to find out was what was the likelihood that you would report. So they presented a variety of scenarios. Now, 97% of these mandated reporters indicated that they absolutely would report if they knew that a child, or an adolescent in this case, was being sexually exploited by a family member. 97%. That's good. 3% are going to hell. But 97%, that's good, right? I mean, I'm thinking, maybe. But as you go further, they said they probably would not report if they knew that that adolescent was being used for the manufacture of pornographic imagery, was being pressured to exchange sex for money or goods, the very definition of trafficking, or was working at a strip club. Probably would not report, because over half, 57% of these reporters said, some adolescent girls just choose to prostitute. She's just a slut. She's just, right? And I'm being graphic for a reason, because if that's our perception, if that's what we think, we have two problems here. One, we have the problem of the legal problem, which is I'm saying that my perception supersedes my legal responsibility. That's significant, is over half are saying, I know that's my job, my license depends on it, right? Or that's my regulatory constraint, but I'm not going to do it because I just know that girl, right? That's a problem. And why I think this is so important is we should all examine our own personal bias, and we should have a good understanding within our organization is what is your perception of a child or an adult, right, engaging in these activities. We all bring bias to the table, just like we do in the family context. So I think this is an important study, and I recommend that this study, or some version of it, should be replicated within each field or perhaps within each enterprise, just so we could have some honest conversations about the role that bias plays. So this really frustrates me, but it also leads me to say sometimes it's done extraordinarily well. All my case studies are a horrible blend of good news, bad news, because it's just the world I live in. And this is one of those good news, bad news situations. So this was the headline in Albuquerque, New Mexico, a couple of years ago, and it said, "Mom and I hustle, a 7-year-old's confession," 7-year-olds confess, leads to dad's prostitution arrest, according to the cops. Now, here's basically the way this story went. I'm going to paraphrase it. So here's this girl, 7 years old, and she is not coming to school on a consistent basis, right? When she is coming to school, she's dirty, she smells, her clothes are not in order, she's hungry, she's falling asleep. And this teacher, who recognized this is obviously a child in need of assistance, takes it on her own to say, the next time this kid comes into class, I'm going to see what I can do to help her. She goes and gets a fresh set of clothing, and she waits for the next time that the child returns to class. When she does, she ushers her into the little girl's room and helps her change into this clean clothing. When she does that, she notices that there's blood on the girl's panties. And she asks her about that, and the girl says, "Mom made me hustle last night." A very strange thing for a girl to say. I think it is so important for us to listen deeper and go, that's odd. Just like some of the things that I was hearing early on. Now, that provoked this teacher, who had had some training, to report it to the principal, who then reported it to law enforcement, and an investigation ensued. And what came to pass was that her biological mother and father, Terry Sanchez and James Stewart, had been taking their daughter to a strip club establishment and sometimes intoxicating her, taking her to a back room, and forcing her to perform sex acts on patrons of that establishment. Like I said, sometimes she was intoxicated, sometimes not. Now, what happened in this particular case, which just good news, bad news, keeps unfolding, was unfortunately, this particular case got thrown out on a mistrial because of inadmissible testimony. And I don't know for a fact, but I have to wonder, because so many of these cases hinge on the testimony of the child. And that is such a difficult proposition. But what's also important for us to understand is most trafficking cases take an incredibly long time to go to court. On average, a child trafficking case will take about 24 to 30 months to go to trial. During that period of time, where's the child? Oftentimes, the child is remanded back to the home because we cannot prove, right? Nobody's been convicted yet. And so the child may go back to the home. Now, we don't know who else is in the home, right? We don't know what that system is that that child is being returned to. But the good news in this particular case was now Terry and James are on the radar, right? Now that family is under scrutiny. And because of that period of time and that scrutiny, what they were able to find out was, in addition to the way they were exploiting their daughter, they also had 2 other children that they were forcing to panhandle out on the highway to make money to support their drug habits, the parents' drug habits. And they had their 8-year-old son repeatedly go to a motel room with 2 men on multiple occasions, basically to do whatever they wanted. So here's a family that was trafficking all 4 of their children and trafficking them in different ways. As tragic as that is, I have to always cling to the good news. And the good news here is, if that teacher had not done what she did in that moment, and because of her training, all 4 kids would not have been identified. And so the value and importance of our having the training and our overcoming our bias, if that teacher just would have said, well, that 7-year-old, she's a little trashy, right? So what we see is a good outcome here. Now, the other case is on appeal, and so we hope that there will be justice for that little girl. All right, so the study then helps us to understand a little bit more about this phenomenon, and the other research suggests that children trafficked by a family member are often much younger than those who are commercially trafficked. So if you have in mind sort of a stereotypic sort of pimp image, right, that children who are trafficked in a familial context much younger is what we're finding in the literature. But this particular study found that children were between the ages of 14 and 17. And what I want you to understand about this is that's not that familial trafficked kids are older. This is just when the child was encountered by the justice professional. We don't know when the onset of the abuse actually happened, but we can imagine this. Isn't it around 14 to 17 that that kid can start to blend in with adults and start to look like, I don't know, she might be 18. And that's when they can start to be hidden in plain sight. But truly, an 8-year-old is not going to be able to blend. So I think that's important for us to understand. Okay? The perpetrator profile in this particular study, consistent with the other, is that the mother was significantly the perpetrator. Again, the person granting access, not necessarily the one inflicting the abuse. Here's what I want you to also understand. The second most common perpetrator profile was mom plus boyfriend. You may not spend your time in the world that I do, but right now, the most common way for a child molester to get access to children, to target children, is they go to online dating sites. They go to online dating sites to find single mothers who are posting pictures of their kids. They're not interested in mother, but they will fake a relationship with mother to get to the children. And so that is why the whole single mother as something that you would just want to be attuned to. Who is that child living with, and who else is in the home? Mom has a boyfriend? Mom's had a lot of boyfriends? Does boyfriend live there? These might be some of the next better questions. We're going to start to go real fast because I got to blow through this in no time unless you want to stay till 7. Some of the other co-occurring risk factors, this just helps us understand what might be the context for this child, what might be also what's going on. And what I think are important takeaways in looking at those conditions that were 75% or more is that we see with other criminal activity in the home, domestic violence, intersection with other systems, we might imagine that maybe these children are on some database somewhere, that we know dad's locked up, mom's been arrested for drugs, the family's on welfare, that maybe they are appearing elsewhere in larger systems, but we're not putting these factors together. Imagine what questions you might be able to ask of somebody in your care relative to these kinds of questions, right? That you might be able to unpack this. And so I'm happy to give you the slides. Now, when I first did this study, I had my own blinders on. And remember the guy who said, I'm sure they're not trafficking them online. And I thought the same thing, because in my nice, cushy life, I was an internet consultant. And I'm like, that's a dumb idea, because that creates a digital trail. Why would you do that? Well, criminality knows no limits, apparently. What we found out in the first study, we didn't even ask the question about whether or not these children were being advertised online. We saw almost 65% of the time, yes, in fact, they are using online means to promote the availability of these children. And we also have to see that if 50% or more often, they were also being taken outside of the home. So the child is not being necessarily abused within the home, but taken out. And the optimism that I have to cling to is great, because then there's at least a chance that somebody might see something and say something. That maybe there's somebody at a motel, that maybe there's somebody at the 7-Eleven, that maybe there's somebody at the McDonald's that might see something. And if we do increase with our awareness and training, we might have a chance of identifying more of these kids. I'm going to skip the case studies. I know, you're sad, but I want to get through the data. Here's what we also found in terms of the motive, the why. Remember, we looked at the contrast between incest and familial trafficking. Interestingly enough, in prior studies, the primary motive for exploiting the child was for cash. But in the 2021 study, we found that the primary motive was for drugs. Now, that's hugely important, because the crime, the fundamental statute of the crime, says that this child is being exchanged for some economic value. You do not have all elements of the crime if you can't prove, remember that CSA with payment, right? If you can't prove that element of the crime. How often do you think the children are privy to the fact that their abuse coordinated with the exchange of heroin, fentanyl, right? And how is a child going to make sense of this? A child, let's say 9 years old, is just going to be able to tell you, I don't know, mommy was sick, and then the man left, and then mommy was well. Get it? Mommy was sick, now she's well. What happened in between? Well, that was bad. But from a 9-year-old's perspective, did I help mommy get well? Think about that. Because how a child makes meaning of their experiences is how they continue to endure abuse. So we have to pay much more attention to that intersection of drugs and familial trafficking. One study found that about a third of the children were being given drugs, much like the girl in New Mexico, were given drugs to ensure their compliance. That's also not going to help us, because if we're trying to rely on testimony from a child, and that child is intoxicated, we are not going to get reliable, credible testimony. This study also yielded something that I think warrants a tremendous more research, and that was, in this particular study, what we found was that when the exploiter profile was just mom, the perpetrator, that there was the transaction and the exchange, and we're done. But when it's mom plus boyfriend, there was also the manufacture of child sexual abuse material. I think opportunistically, not only is the child going to be sold for this abuse, but let's film it because we can make more money off of that. Let's take pictures because we can sell that on the dark web, right? And so that opportunistic, another reason for asking not only who else is in that familial sphere of the child, but we should be integrating from a law enforcement and investigation perspective. Are we taking the CSAM or the child pornography unit And are we marrying it up with the human trafficking unit? In Baltimore, they're totally separate departments. But we may not be seeing the children that are there. So some of the things that I want to leave with you as far as concerns about this particular population is we have to understand that that child lives in a continual state of coercion, okay, of threat, but may not perceive it as threat because it's their normal. Unlike a phase where you have this is the grooming phase, this may be just this is what we do in my family. This is the way it always been. Grandma did it. Mama did it. I just knew I always would, right? Or the child may have no other access, no regular access to other adults or other children in any significant way to test their reality against others to say something in my world is aberrant. But we have to pay a lot of attention to the fact that when we make all of this language in the sex trafficking field about rescue, it's inapplicable when you're talking about your family. You don't get rescued from your family, right? And you have to understand that child has to deal with the dissonance of, if I disclose what's happening to me, I risk losing the only family I have. And every one of us can say, my family's jacked up, but they're mine, right? And that's going to be the child. My family might be jacked up to you, but they're mine. And the proposition of losing mom is a cost we are asking that is too high for a child. I strongly recommend, if you're fascinated by this stuff, probably the best book you could read is Judy Herman's Trauma and Recovery. She does a whole segment on captivity, but it's all about psychological captivity. It's absolutely brilliant. But the whole book is good. She's from Harvard and she writes like it. But whatever, keep going, get coffee. All right, a couple of other things that I want to say before we go ahead and wrap up here, because we've just got about 10 more minutes left. I want to say that for you all, we have to understand it is so unlikely that anybody is going to have an encounter with you and they're going to disclose what's happening. And I would say that's not even your responsibility. Your responsibility is to identify if that child is being abused. That's it. That's it. You do not have to bear the burden of, I've got to figure out if this kid's being trafficked. It is sufficient to know that that child is incurring physical or psychological, emotional abuse, and to develop relationships with law enforcement. And I know that's a sticky one for some people, but we have to do that because we can't sit here and lament the fact that we have no data and we don't have cases going to trial if we are not working together in more of an MDT kind of format. We have to understand that early studies that we have, it's such a neophyte field right now, is that children exploited by family members actually incur fewer injuries than those who are commercially trafficked. So you don't have to be, if you are familiar with the statute of force, fraud, and coercion for human trafficking, there does not need to be any force, right? Do you understand that it is the very nature of the parent's authority that is sufficient to compel that child into compliance? I'm your mother. If that child was raised knowing from the very young age, when I say, go be nice to the man, and you get up and you go in the room, and I go outside the trailer park and wait till it's over, have a cigarette, come back, did I beat you? No. Did I threaten you? No. Did I defraud you? No. But we had our own language where you knew exactly what I meant and what you were supposed to do, which is why we're listening for language that doesn't make sense to us, right? And this presents a tremendous challenge, you can imagine, in a court of law. Because what's going to happen when that child, heaven forbid, is being interrogated and they say, what did your mother possibly do to you to make you go be with all of those men? Well, she said, go be nice to them. Go be nice to the man. Do you see how that presents such a problem? Because the jury's going to say, well, don't we all want our children to be nice to strangers? Did the child take it upon herself? We don't know. And so you see it presents a real complication if we're not listening on this deeper level. We do have to appreciate that the screening tools, while they are out there as an instrument of to perhaps include in your protocols, We examined 33 screening tools, including the See It tool, and none of them ask about the relationship of the perpetrator to the victim. We don't expect that the victim's going to come straight out and say, it's my mother. But if we're not even asking about the relational sphere around that child, if you went home today and your mommy was in the hospital, who would be taking care of you? Who would be making you a meal? Those are all benign questions that you could be asking to try to get a better sense of what's the environment around this child. So I'm hoping that this has been helpful to you, but I want to leave you with one particular comment from a familial trafficking survivor. It's very dear to me. And I always ask my survivors, like, if you were here standing in front of this group of people, what would you want to say to them? And this is a quote from one of my gals. She said, what I want them to do is I want you to decide in advance today what you're going to do. Because in the moment where you're tested, you're going to give in to what believing me costs you. And what she means by that, if that's not already clear, is in the moment, we're going to go, oh my gosh, if I say anything about this, I got to fill out extra paperwork. This is going to go all night. My shift's almost over. Da-da-da-da. That's what it costs you to believe the child. And she says, before you ever get into that situation, decide what you're willing to pay to believe that child. And I think that is profound advice to each one of us. Decide today what you're going to do before the situation happens. So we are grateful. I want to summarize with this. Here's what we learned from this particular study. Large, but one of the newest ones. We're looking at somewhere between a quarter to a half. Biological mother being the most common perpetrator, granting access, not necessarily being the offender. But when we do see a mother-paramour combination, we should at least be asking better questions about whether or not that child is also being used for the manufacture of child sexual abuse material. We saw that the acquisition of drugs or trading that child for drugs was the number one motive, but cash was still the second. So understanding a bit about substance use within that family, the economic stability of that family would be helpful. And that we have to appreciate that there is going to be family collusion, because like any system, when a system is threatened, what does it do? It closes in on itself. And so if all of a sudden that child has been somewhat identified by a teacher asking too many questions, or that medical person asking too many questions, it's going to be, girl, you better shut up. Because all your brothers and sisters are going to go to foster care, and your mom is going to go to jail, and you're never going to see, and it's all going to, right? The system closes in, and the child says, I can't pay that price. That price is too high. So we have got to be attendant to the really complex set of relational dynamics that are going on in this particular case. We do not have the freedom that we have had in other commercial trafficking, where we can say, you've been rescued from that evil pimp. You should be so grateful. You're a survivor now. Because these particular victims will say, and that's always going to be my family. That's always my family. There's a slide that I have that I didn't include, but it's a gal. She's 33 years old, Christy Huxell, 33 years old in Tennessee, and her parents are still taking her to a motel, still setting up the dates, still buying the condoms. And you just have to pause on that, and you say, that is a grown woman who should be able to make her own decisions, and she's still being controlled by her parents. What is the tie that binds there that we don't understand, that we can't possibly see, that is so deeply, deeply ingrained that it would last well into her adulthood? And I don't think she's terribly unusual. So for those of you who want the slides, I left my business cards up there. You can also email me. I put together my favorite list of reading. None of these are beach reads, okay? And most of these you don't just leave around on the coffee table. But they're fantastic books, probably some of the better. I would say, just by virtue of some that I think are terrifically important. Herman's work on father-daughter incest is a great study in incest, but probably the most pivotal chapter. She does a whole chapter on moms and why victims who are victims of incest are so angry at the non-offending parent. And that's a phenomenon we need to better understand. Sexual predators, if you really want to get into the mind of people who abuse children, it's a light read. And then Miss America by Day, which oddly enough is a great read, true story about Marilyn Vanderburg, who was Miss America in 1957. And she takes us through her journey of having been molested by her father from the age of 8 to 18 and her adulthood journey that helps us to really understand things like somatic trauma, and her long-term recovery journey and how memory unfolded over a long period of time and how she dealt with the dissociation of being the night child and the day child. It's a great read because she's a good writer if you want to try to understand people who've had this kind of what we now should be calling complex relational trauma. And then you can waste hours and hours and hours of your life on Soft White Underbelly if you haven't ever been there. On some amazing videos of people who've lived really, really hard lives, but they take us in and help us to understand.